so I don't forget to record the presentation. You will have access to this recording indefinitely, not like, oh, hey, you get it for the next 24 hours. You'll be able to download it, or you'll be able to have a private YouTube link. Also be able to, if you're signed up for the entire series, it is there when you log in, and you'll be able to watch that all the way through. So definitely plenty of access to that. There's also follow-up materials that will come with this. So Sean has put together a workflow document related to this. He'll also have the link related to his free lake bled tutorial. One of the things I'll offer, which I offered a couple other people, if you already have Sean's lake bled tutorial, just email me and I can set you up with a different tutorial. One of the photo pills ones, or the ones on Topaz that are pretty good quality, they're out there as well. So certainly in that regard, we should be good to go. So the only final thing I'll say, I actually don't have usually an intro deck to talk through there, but I am Nick Stover. I'm the founder of Nature Photography Classes, for those of you that don't know me. And I'm here with Sean Bagshaw tonight. Sean is a preeminent, I would say, in my words, this is somebody I learned from early in my process, Photoshop educator. Sean has an education background that really shows through in the way that he teaches his work and brings forth a lot of stuff. I've learned a tremendous amount from Sean in these personal little things. And so we're all going to learn a lot as we go through tonight, which is really exciting. Please put your questions into the Q&A. You'll see down at the bottom chat, there's the chat, which you can do to kind of dialogue back and forth. If you don't like the chat, some people like the chat annoys them, you can actually just open up the window and drag it to the corner of your screen. You won't see it. But the only way I can guarantee I'll see your questions is if they're in the Q&A. And we'll be taking breaks throughout to answer those questions in the Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A as we go forward. So with that, Sean is our final speaker in the winter speaker series. I know a lot of you have been with us all the way through the entire speaker series. We started with Michael Fry, showing us a lot about range masks and local adjustments, progressed into David Kingham and working a lot with tones and curves. Excellent presentation. A couple weeks ago, we got the master Nick Page himself to show us a lot of tips and tricks and luminosity masking as well. And so tonight is kind of the culmination of the winter series, and I'll talk briefly at the end about the next upcoming series. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sean, and let's get rolling.
All right, let's do it. And Nick, before I get going here, am I shooting for an hour and a half, 2 hours? Where should I go for?
Yeah, we're shooting until I told people that they could plan to have dinner about 6 o'clock, or for the East Coasters go to bed about about 9 o'clock their time. So
okay,
we should be good to go there, but we'll wrap you up right on time so people can go on their way. So
perfect. Okay, awesome. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see everybody out there. Saw some familiar names coming through on the sign-in. So thanks for all the folks I know and everybody I don't know. It's really nice to have you here with us. As Nick said, I am Sean Bagshaw. I'm based in Southern Oregon, Ashland, Oregon. And as Nick also said, I'm here in my new world headquarters of outdoor exposure photography. Anyone who has watched my videos in the past, either on my YouTube channel or any of, maybe owns some of my Photoshop courses, knows that this isn't what I'm normally, my background normally looks like. I moved homes about 4 months ago or so, November, I think, early November. Didn't move far, still in the same town, only about a mile away. The view out my window is still the same view, but it was just time for a move. And so I've been working since then, trying to get my new office and studio space up and running. It's a little smaller, but it's really coming together nice. I like it. So I'm going to start off here. I'm going to share my screen and share some of my photos because that's how everyone else started out. So I figured I would just start out the same way. Let's see here, make sure I'm in the right place. See my screen okay?
Looks great.
Okay, so just some of my photos throughout the years. I am a landscape, nature, and travel photographer like many of us. I do a lot of photography around Oregon coast, and then throughout the Western US and around the world. And, I think my photos, they're a lot about adventure. They're a lot about light. They're a lot about exploration. and anything from grand landscapes to smaller, more intimate scenes, the kind of stuff we see a lot of photographers doing these days. So if you're not familiar with any of my photography work, this is just a little sample of what some of that looks like. And I don't want to stay on this too long showing photos, but you get the idea. So let's get out of there and let me head over to where we're going to be working with here. And let me say, first of all, in addition to being a photographer, of course, I am a photography educator. That's been a big part of my career as a photographer. And it's a real honor for me to be able to be part of this amazing speaker series. I think that Nick has really hit on a great formula. I know the fall series was amazing. He's really brought in some well-known and really excellent speakers. And this winter image developing or image processing series has been great. I have watched every single episode as we've been going through. I've learned a lot from all three of the presenters previous to me. And I've actually watched Michael and David and Nick present many times. And I always learn something from them, and they are so talented. And what I'm going to do today is similar. It's going to be more image developing, but what the previous presentations were able to do was focus in on some, in combination to the developing techniques, also a lot about those photographers' creative process and how they use those techniques to kind of communicate their vision through their photography. Now, what I'm going to be covering today is blending techniques, mostly in Photoshop. And this is going to be a little more technical, a little more procedural, a little more complex even. It's going to be a lot of information that's going to be coming at you really quickly because we do have limited time. So as I often do in such situations, I'm channeling Yoda for this. Hopefully that'll help the message come through the force. And I'm not going to entirely rely on Yoda. Of course, you've got the video replay that you can watch of this presentation. I think that'll be really helpful, being able to go back and rewatch it. You may need to watch some of this many times and practice along with it to really make it stick. And also because I know watching a video and trying to work and watch a video isn't always possible, to have an actual outline of the steps of a procedure can be really helpful as well. So as Nick said, that's available for download. All the steps of everything I'm going to be doing, I try to write it out as clearly and concisely as possible, so you always have that as a resource and a reference. Now, what is blending specifically? Well, blending really just comes down to, in photography, and as far as I'm concerned, blending just comes down to any technique that you're using to combine multiple frames into a single image. So multiple images into one image. And this can be something that's very creative. There's a whole universe of artists out there who do photo composites, photo illustration, digital illustrations that combine elements of many different photos all into one kind of fantastical image that's photorealistic, but probably doesn't, actually exist like that. Now, that's not how I use blending in my work. I'm a big fan of a lot of those artists who do that kind of work, and it's extremely challenging and difficult to do. But I use blending to overcome limitations that we have with camera gear. It's a tool that I think of using when I'm confronted with some of those limitations. It's not something that I plan to do as, just I'm going to go out and, take some photos to blend. That's not what my approach is. I'm in the field taking images. And if I run into an image, a scene, a vision that I have for a photograph, and I can't get it in a single frame in my camera with good quality, then I think, okay, what are some other options that I have? And that's when I go to this idea of blending multiple frames. But I want to make really clear that my first priority, if I can do it, is to work with a single frame if I can. That's where I always go to first. If I can get good image quality out of a single frame out of my camera, that simplifies everything. That makes my whole creative process that much easier. And that's just my preference. And to kind of demonstrate that, every image that I showed just a few minutes ago in my intro, none of those photos use multiple frame techniques in any way. Those are all single frame photos out of the camera, then developed showing using a lot of the techniques that you saw, that some of you saw from Michael and David and Nick, but none of these techniques I'm going to be doing today were used to create any of those photos. So it's one of those things I use when I need it, but I don't use it when I don't need it. And that's a really, I think, important thing to realize. Now, there's a lot of different blending techniques, more than I have time to show today. We're going to really focus in on 4 main ones today. And these 4 that I'm going to be working with today to show you are to overcome specific limitations that we have with the gear, physical limitations. You know, our cameras are amazing these days. They record all kinds of wonderful things, but they can't always record everything that we want. So what are the things that we're going to be working on today? What types of blending? Number 1 is if you have a limitation with your gear in depth of field, meaning that you can't get everything sharp within the frame from front to back, and you want to, then the type of blending that we can do that works around that limitation is called focus stacking. So that's number 1. Another limitation is apparent distance and size, depending on your focal length that you're using. So for example, one thing is when you use a really wide angle lens, that's great for foregrounds, but things in the distance like mountains can end up looking like little bumps on the horizon, not at all how we experienced them or saw them. So overcoming that limitation is called focal length blending. Also, another thing is sometimes the camera perspective can't record the whole scene the way you want to from a single perspective. So when we change the camera's perspective to create multiple frames, that's something we do to overcome that limitation is perspective blending. And you'll be familiar with perspective. I think most people are familiar with the idea of panorama stitching. That's a type of perspective blending. And there's some other types that you can do as well that I'll be talking about. And then finally, the final limitation that we're going to be talking about is the how good your camera is at recording high contrast light or high dynamic range light, and the technique for overcoming the limitation of not being able to record all the light in a scene is exposure blending. And now in the last presentation, Nick Page did a great job of showing single frame blends using luminosity masks. And this is going to be very similar to that, except for all of those that he showed, he was able to get all of the light in a single frame from his camera. But sometimes we run into situations in the field where you can't, and you need multiple frames. So it's going to be similar, but different. We'll get to there. So, like I said, in most photographic situations, these techniques are not necessary. So just realize going in that these are techniques that you may only use very rarely. And that's why the outline in the video will be helpful, because when it comes up, you can refer back to them and use them when you need them. But this isn't something that you're going to do unless you're someone who is out only doing a certain type of photography in certain situations where you have to use these all the time. You won't use them all the time. Now, knowing when to record multiple frames and how to record multiple frames can be very challenging. And that's something that really I'm talking about how to combine the frames, not how to, what the techniques in the field need to be. But if those questions come up as I'm going along, and how do you know when to focus bracket, or how do you focus bracket your frames, feel free to throw those in the Q&A, and Nick will let me know, and I'll try to answer them the best I can as we have time for. All right, so I have some user submitted images, although a lot of the images kind of focused in on more of the exposure blending type blending. So I'll be using mostly my images to demonstrate what these techniques are, how these work. And then if we have some time, we'll get into some of your images as well. And with all of that said, let's get directly into the first method, which is focus stacking. Okay, so focus stacking. It is, oops, I lost, hang on a second. Where did that just disappear to? It's one of the problems with Zoom here is you end up with so many windows open. Here it is. Okay, got it. So focus stacking allows you to combine frames with different focus points. So this is a situation where, again, if you can get the whole scene sharp in focus with a single frame, or if I can, that's always my first choice. And it isn't always possible, and that's where focus blending comes into use. So to do focus blending, I'm going to open up, this is a stack of, let me reduce this here so we can see all four across here. This is a stack of 4 images. And the reason why I decided to focus stack these is because my lens was, this front flower here was probably only just a few inches away from that. And so when you're that close to a foreground subject, and then you have things this far in the background, there's no aperture that you can use. It's a physical limitation of the optics of your lens to get enough depth of field to get all of that in focus. Now, all this flower would have to do is move a couple of feet away from the lens, and now all of a sudden I can do it. So it only happens with wide angle situations where you've got something really close to the lens, or it can happen with telephoto lenses if you're zooming in on a subject, but the background's much farther behind the subject. Or other times that you might need to use focus stacking is if it's low light and you just can't use a small aperture. You need to keep your aperture open in order to let more light in. So in that case, you've got a shallower depth of field, you may need to focus stack. But whatever the case is, when you focus stack, if we take a look here, whoops, let me zoom in here on this guy. You can see this first one, I focused pretty much right on this flower to get this front flower in focus. Then in the next frame, if we jump over, I probably focused back on these flowers. And the next frame, probably back kind of in the middle ground here. And for this final frame, I focused way back here. So that's focus bracketing as you leave your tripod set really firmly. You don't want anything to move as far as the camera goes. And the only thing you're changing is your focus point. And how many focus points you take depend on the scene, first of all, and how close you are to a subject, and also what your aperture is. Now, I was able to photograph this at f13, which is still a fairly small aperture, so I've got a lot of overlap. I didn't need a lot of focus frames. If I was using, let's say, f5.6, I would need more frames to have enough overlap to get it all sharp all the way through the image. Now, focus stacking can be done in Photoshop, cannot be done in Lightroom or Camera Raw. This is a thing you need Photoshop for, or there's also other software out there available that will do focus stacking. You can also manually focus blend in Photoshop or any software that allows you to use masks and layers. I'm going to show you today how to do Photoshop focus stacking because it does a pretty good job. And if you have Photoshop, that's what you're probably going to use. Another piece of software that is useful for this, if you do a lot of focus stacking and you want a little more functionality than what Photoshop provides, there's a piece of software called Helicon Focus. And I actually have in the outline a procedure for kind of a simple procedure for how to use Helicon Focus. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages of that later on. But the main thing we're going to show, most people are going to have Photoshop, so let's see how to do it with that. So the first thing, either in Lightroom or in Camera Raw, whatever you do to make raw adjustments, you need to get your image adjusted, raw adjustments made to that image before you go to Photoshop. So using the things you learned from Michael and from David, if you watch their presentations, you're going to do those sorts of Lightroom or Camera Raw adjustments first to get that image looking as close to how you want it as possible first. Then you're going to select all the frames in your focus stack that are going to be in your focus stack, and you're going to synchronize all those adjustments. Let me go over the develop module here. If you take a look, you can see the adjustments I've done, and I've done some global adjustments here in the main tab. I've also done some masked adjustments as Michael Fry was showing us in his presentation. So I've done all that. I'm not going to show you those, but just know that I got this image looking how I want it. synchronized, and now it's time to head to Photoshop. And the reason why we have to do that here first is to do the auto aligning and auto focus blending in Photoshop. We can't use smart objects. So it'd be nice to be able to open these as raw smart objects, do the blend, and then have the ability to still access our raw information and do the adjustments on the far end. But in this case, we can't. We have to open up regular non-smart objects. So once I've got all those selected, I can just right click and I'm going to go to edit in, and I'm going to come all the way down here to open them as layers in Photoshop. If you're working out of Camera Raw, it's a little different to open as layers. You still need to select them all, and it's one of the choices on the open button. But anyway, open as layers is what we're going to do. So this is going to jump us over here to Photoshop. Well, let me go full screen on Photoshop when we get a chance. I don't know why it took me out of full screen. Okay, so it takes a little while to open those all up. You see that Lightroom is opening all of those focus frames right here in Photoshop as their own layers, but all in one document. And done. Okay, so now we've got them all in here. The procedure of doing the focus stacking or focus blending to get all of these different focal points into one single frame isn't difficult. It's very automated. It does it for you, but there are a few workarounds that I've learned over the years, because Photoshop does an okay job, but not always a great job. And you need to be able to work with and make corrections to what Photoshop messes up. And these are the steps that took me a long time, and I had to learn them from someone else. I wish I could say that I came up with these on myself, but by myself, but I'm not that smart. So here are the steps. These are the steps that are in the outline. And let me take you through this. So I'm going to close some stuff here. You saw Nick, if you were at Nick's presentation last time, he used the TK multi-mask module to generate and deploy his luminosity mask for that. That's what this panel is up here. It's a third-party plugin made by Tony Kuiper for Photoshop. I'm going to close that. We don't need that for what we're doing. And this here is also part of the TK plugin. This is called the CX module up here, and it does a whole bunch of things that we're going to do in Photoshop anyway. But normally you need to go to menus and keyboard shortcuts and all that stuff. This just puts them right out there in a toolbar right in your workspace. I'm going to do everything not with the TK module, even though in my normal workflow I do, but I know not everyone has that. So I'm going to be using Photoshop's interface so that no one gets lost with that. All right. Now, the first step, the first thing we need to do here is get these images aligned, because if I turn off the visibility of each one of these layers, as we work our way down, you can see that even though I didn't move my tripod and I didn't zoom the image at all, there is a little bit of zooming that's happening. And that zooming is something called focus breathing. And basically, it just means that when you change the focus on your lens, the optics are doing a little bit of zooming to change the focal point. So these images don't perfectly line up. So we need to get them aligned. And the way to do this in Photoshop, and this is one of the reasons why we couldn't use smart objects, is we need to select them all. So the top one selected, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click the bottom one. So we select all those layers. And now I'm going to come up to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And in Auto Align Layers, I'm going to use, for focus stacking, I'm going to use the auto projection, which is this one right here. And vignette removal and geometric distortion, I did that in RAW in Lightroom, so I don't want to do it again here. I generally do that in my Lightroom adjustments instead of here in Photoshop. So really, I just have the auto projection checked, and then I click OK, and I let Photoshop go about figuring out how to align these focus frames. And when it is done, you'll see that now when I go through these, all the different elements in the scene are aligned perfectly. And that focus breathing, it's actually, sized down each one of these layers a little bit. And this little gap that we see on the edge, that's where that difference in the focus breathing is in those little edges. And we'll cut those off later, so we don't need to worry about those. So we are now in alignment. and we're still having all of our images or layers selected. Now, here's the next step that's different, that's not part of the normal Photoshop procedure for this. And this is the key to being able to do good focus blending in Photoshop. And that is right now, while these are all selected, I'm going to do a Control, or on a Mac, Command J, Control or Command J. And what that does is it copies. These are my original layers, and these are all the copies of those layers. And the copies are all selected now. And I'm going to focus stack the copies and leave the originals untouched. So with all of the copies selected, I'm going to come up to Edit and come down to Auto Blend Layers. Click on that. And now in the Auto Blend Layer dialog, you have two different blend methods you can do. You can do panoramas. That's not what we're doing right now. And in fact, we're going to talk about stitching panoramas in a minute later on. And I don't actually use Photoshop for that anymore. We'll get to that. We want to stack these images, focus stack them. And I do check seamless tones and colors. I think as I was going through, you notice that even though I synchronized my settings, there were some slight exposure differences in the frame. So this will help smooth that out. Content aware, fill, transparent areas, those transparent areas, I'm going to crop those off anyway. So I can have that checked or not checked, doesn't matter. I'm going to crop it off. All right, so now I'm going to click OK and let Photoshop do its magic, its focus stacking. And it's got some sort of algorithms and artificial intelligence that evaluates where the sharpness is in each of those layers and where it's not. And Photoshop creates its own series of masks that create the blend. So if we take a look at those masks, we can see they're pretty crude, rudimentary masks. But this shows us how each layer is being used and what parts of each layer is being used to create the final focus stacked image. And let's just see. So here we have full focus up front on that flower and all the way through the middle ground and all the way into the background, these background mountains, everything's as sharp as I wanted it to be. So the focus stack has been done, and that's awesome. But once you've created that focus stack, the next thing you need to do in Photoshop is you need to zoom into 100%. And I'm actually going to zoom in beyond 100% so you can see it better in the video. So I'm going to go to like 300%, or I may even go in more. And then we're going to look around in the image and look for places like right there at the end of this flower petal, or at the end of this little guy right here. You can see the fuzziness. Let's see where else. Oh, yeah, there's more fuzziness along this edge. In this leaf back here, there's some fuzziness here, up here. So a lot of areas where Photoshop didn't get the blend right. I think there's usually another spot down here. Oh, yeah, like that right there. For whatever reason, Photoshop goofed. It didn't take the information. Its mask didn't work from the right spot. Now you might think, okay, well, I know how Photoshop layers and masks work. All I need to do is find which mask is the one that's causing that to come from the wrong layer and go in and paint on that mask. And if we look, I just happen to know from working and practicing with this, that that is the mask right there that's causing the problem of that blurry area. And it's white there. We actually want that mask to be black there. So if I were to come in with a black paintbrush, so let me grab a paintbrush tool, make sure it's black. And come in and paint. Let me get my brush size down here and paint on this mask with a black brush. I can bring through the sharp correct layer from underneath, but you'll also notice that because of the way these masks are interacting with each other, that it's actually, whoops, forgot what was, I'm going to zoom in even more. That's as far as I can go with that. Well, I think you can see right here that just working with that mask alone, I've still got issues. There's a hard edge there, probably from a different mask. Anyway, trying to deal with these masks from Photoshop is almost impossible. So I just backed out of that. These masks are not good. It's good for Photoshop to do the blending, but for us to work with, no good. So what do we do in that case? Well, what we do is we need to take all of these merged focus stack images and combine them into a single layer. And to do that, we select all of these layers. Actually, you don't even need to select all the layers. We're just going to merge all the layers that are here. And you do this with a keyboard shortcut. I think Nick talked about it last time. It's a big keyboard shortcut. It's in the outline. It's Control Alt Shift E on a Windows machine, or Command Option Shift E on a Mac. And when we do that, we create a merged layer that's focus blended at the top. So this is our focus blended sharp all the way through image. So we're sharp everywhere. We've got it. We've got all the information of these 4 layers in that one layer now. So what that means is I can now just delete these layers. So I'm going to select them all, click the trash can. Those guys are gone. And now I have my original unadulterated layers with no masks on them yet that I can use to fix Photoshop's mistakes. And this is the key for being able to use Photoshop to do effective focus stacking. So let's go back down to that little area where we were having a problem. Where was it? It was here. I got to zoom way in on it so you can see. So now this top layer is the merged layer. This is the focus stacked layer. I'm just going to call it merged, so I remember what it is. And then these are the different layers underneath. So if I turn off this top layer, I'll see the layer that's underneath it. And I want to find which layer has the sharp information for right there. So I'm going to turn off the top layer, and it looks like maybe that one right underneath is it. But let's turn that one off and see if the one underneath is any better. It's not. So this is the layer that I need for right there. So I'm going to turn my merged layer back on. I'm going to drag this layer to the top, and I'm going to add a black mask to that layer. And I can add a black mask by holding down Alt, or I think it works on a Mac, Option, and clicking on the mask button. And that gives you, if you hold down Alt or Option, click on the mask button, that gives you a black mask. If it doesn't work that way on a Mac for some reason, I'm not a Mac user, you can just make a white mask and then go to Control I to invert the mask and make it black. Control or Command I. All right, so now that I've got this layer up on top, I want to use a white paintbrush. So paintbrush tool, white, and I'm going to paint on this black mask with that white paintbrush. And now I can bring in the properly sharp areas from that frame right there without those artifacts of the Photoshop masks that just mess everything up. So now I've got that. And then I would continue around the rest of the image looking for any other mistakes. Now I'm zoomed so far in, 400%. Let's zoom out a little bit so this doesn't take so forever. As I look around, Photoshop did a pretty good job on this one, but we know that up here in the flowers, there were some issues. So I'm going to zoom in on those. Let's work on those. Now, this petal up here, I want to get sharp. The question is the sharp petal in this one, this layer that I already moved to the top, or is it in one of these other layers down below? Well, I can check this top one first. All I need to do is turn off the mask to see all of this layer, to see if it's sharp there. So to turn off a mask, you hold down the Shift key and you click on it. So I just turned off the mask, and sure enough, that petal is sharp on that layer, but the background's pretty blurry. So let's see. That's that layer. That's pretty good. Let's go down. I'm going to turn off the merge layer so we can look at some of these layers too. So that one is also sharp on the petal, but I think the background's a little sharper. Let's see. Yeah, that top one is blurrier in the background. This one is a little sharper in the background. So I actually want to work on this from this layer. So this layer gets moved to the top. A black mask gets added. Alt click on the mask button, or Option click, or just make a white mask and Control or Command I to invert it to black. And then again, same procedure. White paintbrush, make it a nice small paintbrush. I don't need to be that far in probably for you to see. Let's see, let's try here. All right. Oh, and I need to turn on my merge layer so that we're actually seeing the blurry flower petal that's in that merge layer. But now on this mask up here, I can paint white right through here and bring in that nice sharp edge to my flower and all down through here. And let's see, I think over here, this little issue can probably be fixed on this layer. Yep, looks good. There's some issues along this edge, fix that. And I would just continue everywhere I think that's in this focal plane, that's in this focal point. I would use this to fix it. All the errors and this is fiddly. This takes a while. This is one reason why you might want to invest. If you do this a lot for Helicon Focus, there's less of this to do with Helicon Focus. There still is some, but it's definitely less. And how much of this there is to do largely depends on if anything moved in your image between frames. Even when nothing moved, like if you have an image that's nothing but rock and nothing moved at all, and your camera didn't move at all, you can still find places where Photoshop messed up the blend, but much fewer. All of these issues are because the flowers were in slightly different places in different frames and Photoshop got confused. If things are really windy, I don't even try focus stacking, because if things move very much between frames, getting this to look good is almost impossible, just not worth it for me. I'll figure out a way to do it from a single frame. All right, so anyway, I'd keep going. I also noticed that back here, this leaf is a little blurry back there. I don't know, let's look down. I know it's not gonna be either one of these two because these are in front of that. Let's turn off the merge layer again. So this one is better back there. Let's see about this one. That one, the very bottom one's the one that's really sharp for back there. So I'm gonna move this one to the top and add a black mask to that. And whoops, turn my merged layer back on. So we're seeing the whole image. And now with that white paintbrush, I can come in and again, carefully paint in sharp leaves back behind here. And any place where I feel these background leaves were a little blurry, I can bring those in. There's a bunch of them like back in here. And even down in here, you know, I don't know how careful I'd want to be, or if I care if some of these depths are a little out of focus, but if I did care, this is the process I would need to do. Time consuming, but doable. And eventually, you know, continuing that process throughout the whole image, everywhere where I find issues, I'm eventually going to end up with a completed focus stack sharp image all the way. And at this point, I have some choices. I can leave all of these layers and masks intact so that if I ever in the future found another issue, I could come back and continue fixing it. Or if I felt like I had this nailed, I've searched every pixel of the image, there's nothing else left to fix, I could flatten all of these layers if I felt that confident, but just knowing that if I did, and I found something, an issue later, I couldn't come back to these layers and masks. And then once I'm completed that, I now pretend like this was an image out of my camera. Well, actually, not quite. There's one more thing I do. At this point, I grab the crop tool. And this image is a 3:2 ratio. So I want to maintain that 2:3 crop ratio. And then I would zoom in to 100% and look at the edges for the focus breathing issue and any blurriness caused by focus breathing. I've got blurriness on the edge here. There's nothing that I can blend in from a different layer to fix that, because remember, each of these layers is moving in because of the alignment from the focus breathing. So there's nothing to fix here. So what I'm going to do is just crop inside of the blurry area on that side. I'm going to come over to this side. You can see that blurry edge there. I'm going to crop inside of the blurry edge there. I'm going to look at the top. Not seeing a blurry edge. I've already come in quite a ways from that. Whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. Let's go down to the bottom and double check down here. Whoa, all the way down. And again, I think I'm up enough from the blurry edge there. So once that's done, I can, if I don't want to keep these pixels, which I don't, then I would check the delete crop pixels box, and then I could hit the check mark or hit the enter key to commit to that crop. So now I've cropped it. And then from here, I would pretend like this was a single frame for my camera, and I would continue image developing as if it was, as if it had come out of my camera this way, and using a lot of those techniques that we've seen in the other presentations. I could do it here in Photoshop, or I could save this as a TIFF file and then go import it back into Lightroom and do additional adjustments in Lightroom if that was my preference. Okay, so that is focus stacking in Photoshop. Now, like I said, in Helicon Focus, the process is very similar. The masks that it makes are much more detailed and sophisticated than Photoshop's focus blending masks. So you have fewer problems. And when you do have problems, there is a tool for fixing the problems, which is a little more intuitive to use than the layer and mask method that I showed you. One other thing I do want to show, for anyone who is a TK panel user, just so you know, there is an action built into it that helps with this process. So I'm going to get rid of the merged layer that we made, and I'm also going to delete the masks off of these layers. So we're back now to just having our original layers that we started with. And remember, this is where I did the alignment and I did the Photoshop focus stacking. And then I made the copy. No, sorry, I made the copies. Then I did the focus stacking. Then I deleted the Photoshop layers with the masks and all of that. Well, if you just start with your focus frames, and in the TK combo or CX module, you come into the TK menu and just go align and focus. That one button right there will do all of those steps for you. There it goes. It's making the copies, it's aligning, it's blending, it's doing all the stuff. And so that can really speed up this whole process. Now we're ready to go. We got the merged one on top. We've got our original layers on the bottom, and I'm ready to go in and fix any problems. So if you have the panel, just remember that that's there for you. That's a great resource that'll speed up your process. Okay.
Awesome.
That is focus stacking. Did I
All right, well,
lose everyone?
We have a proliferation of questions.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So I'm trying to group these, and they're just absolutely fantastic questions all around, some of which you answered as you went through. A couple of questions, I think, on just technique. Do you use in-camera focus stacking? I think you could do it on the new Canon R5s, and the Nikons have it. Is that something you're utilizing? Absolutely.
If you need to use the in-camera focus stacking, if your camera has it, it's very useful. It's great. However, I tend to only use that if I'm in a situation where I'm really pressed for time, because maybe clouds are moving or something's moving in the scene that I need to really fire off those frames as quickly as possible. Or sometimes you can even do handheld focus stacks. And that's really useful for that, because if you're trying to manually focus hand holding, you're probably not going to keep everything in alignment. So I do use it in those situations. However, if I'm on a tripod and things aren't moving a lot and I'm not pressed for time, I still like to manually bracket my focusing, because then I totally get to choose where my focus points are, how many focus frames I take to get everything I need. Whereas with the auto focus bracketing, you have to preset all of that and hope that the settings are what you need. And a lot of times I've gotten back and found out that how I had it set it didn't give me everything I needed, or it didn't focus in the right places, or it didn't take enough frames or whatever. So yeah, I tend to go manual on things unless I absolutely have to trust the robot overlords to do it for me.
Exactly. Well, a couple questions came in related to, does it matter on the order of the images in terms of the layer stacking?
In Photoshop or in Helicon Focus, it does not. Basically, you open them up, it looks at them all, determines how to create the masks to bring through the sharp areas where the sharpness is needed and to hide the blurry areas, and it figures that out. Okay, caveat, I do think that the order can sometimes give better results in terms of Photoshop getting confused. So it's not required, but if you're not getting good results, and I don't know what order, I don't know if there's a set order, it's just how Photoshop reads it. But if you're not getting good results from Photoshop, try rearranging the order of the layers and running it again. And a lot of times when you do that, it'll do a better job, or it'll do a worse job, but it's worth experimenting.
Interesting. Okay, that's good to know. So some questions related, and I know we're not talking just about tech, we're talking about the whole thing, and we'll move on to the next thing here in a second, but questions related to, at what point in time do you stop down your aperture or stop, or people were asking specifically, how narrow of an aperture would you consider to go when you're focus stacking, or, a lot of things on that.
Very common questions. And the best answer I can give for that is it depends on your gear. The reason why we don't want to really stop down our apertures is because of diffraction that softens. So you're trying to get everything sharp and you get more depth of field, but with a really small aperture, the way the light bends through that little opening in your lens, it can create softness, especially kind of around the edges of the scene. And so it's this toss up of how small do I go with my aperture, and where's the trade-off between depth of field and loss of sharpness from diffraction. But it's not the same for every lens. So test your lenses. And I've done that. I've tested all my lenses at different apertures, just taken test shots and then evaluated them. And most lenses, and the lenses I'm using, I can easily stop down to f16, f18 without a considerable loss of sharpness. So I'm fine. If I can get everything in focus at f18, I would much rather do that in a single frame because it's still going to be plenty sharp compared to like almost negligible or unnoticeable difference from then having to focus stack at, let's say, f13 or f11 or f8. F22 even on my lenses is still usable pretty good. So if I've got things moving like wind, I'll shoot f22 rather than f13 or f11 and try to focus stack on a windy day, because it's f22 is going to look better. But I have photographed with lenses that at f8 they looked great, and at f13 the diffraction was horrible and it was unusable. So you need to know your lens, and if your lens looks good at f18, shoot at f18 and do it in a single frame. If your lens looks horrible at f13, then do what you got to do, but know your gear.
Okay. Well, we have more questions, but I think some of them are going to be ones that as we go through, you may be able to answer. So let's roll into the next demonstration technique, and just know that if you need a break to come back to questions, there's plenty here. So
okay, good. And like I said, I think there'll be plenty of time for questions as we go. Some will get answered, and we can definitely probably have some time at the end for questions as well. All right, let's keep on going here. Oops, let me go back to Lightroom. The next type of, focus stacking, the first way around a limitation of our equipment for depth of field. Now let's go into another situation here. Okay, this limitation, like I said, is to deal with focal length. So we like to use wide angle lenses to really take in everything that's in the foreground for us. You have all this interesting stuff in the foreground of some scenes, like the rocks and the waves and everything in this image. But the wider angle you go, the more diminution you get of things in the distance. So they look smaller than they actually did. So here in Norway, this bay isn't that far across. These mountains were absolutely towering, but when I used a 20 millimeter focal length to get the foreground that I wanted, those mountains start looking really tiny, and that's only at 20. If I'd gone to 16 or 14 or 11 millimeters, those guys would just be pimples on the horizon. Not at all how I was seeing it. And yet, if I zoom in to 35 millimeters, which that is more how those mountains look to me, now I can't get that foreground in that I'm seeing. I can stand there and see the foreground, and I can see the mountains looking like this, but I just can't get them both in the same focal length. So if you run into that situation, we're going to do focal length blending. Now, there's no automated focal length blending feature that I know of in Photoshop. So this is going to be a manual blend. And this technique that we're going to use for this is going to be similar in a few of these different techniques. Not exactly the same, but similar. So what we do is we take usually it's two. I've got my foreground frame and I've got my background frame. And I'm not made any adjustments. At this point, I haven't made any raw adjustments other than probably things like chromatic aberration removal and white balance and maybe some of that stuff. But we're going to open these as raw smart objects in Photoshop because we don't need to use any auto aligning or auto blending or anything. So we can come back to our raw adjustments later once the images have been merged or blended, so that we know how to get them to match up better. So instead of trying to do that ahead of time, we're going to do that later. So select them both, right click, and go to edit in. And this time, instead of opening them as layers, I'm going to open them as smart objects in Photoshop. Open as smart objects. And here we go. It'll take a second to get these opened up in Photoshop, and Photoshop didn't go full screen again. All right. So here we are in Photoshop, and here is my 35mm frame. Here is my 20mm frame. They're not together in the same image document as layers because the smart object thing doesn't allow you to open them that way. So we need to get them in there, and we need to get them stacked without breaking the smart objects. If you have the TK panel, you can just, again, come down to the TK action menu and just do the stack action. That'll just automatically do it for you. Otherwise, the easiest way, and I do this, I put my background layer or frame on top of my foreground layer. And to do that, you can just do a Control or Command C to copy. Don't select anything or anything like that, just a straight Control or Command C. And now we'll go over to the background frame and Control or Command V. Oops, didn't do it because I didn't have the layer highlighted. Control or Command C, head on over, Control or Command V. There we go. So now we've got those guys stacked on top of each other, and it just matches the frame, just centers it. It's a nice way to go, and it did not break the smart objects. So perfect. Now, the next thing we need to do is decide how we're going to bring these two frames together so that it looks natural, looks how it appeared to us when we were there. Now, this image, I used this actually in one of my courses that I did many, many years ago. It's been out there for a while, so some of you are probably familiar with it. And I did this for that course and for this example here, because I happen to have this nice, perfectly straight shoreline with water, with not a lot of detail, which makes this easier. But I'm also going to show you how to do it if you run into a situation that's not easy like this. Well, let's start with the easy way first. So I'm going to be moving this top layer up, because if we look, the horizon is up here, or the shoreline is up here in this frame, and it's way down here in this frame. So this shoreline has to go up to meet the other one. We can see it over there. It's going to go way up here. The problem is when I get the shorelines aligned, my mountains are really crowded against the top of the frame, and most of my cool clouds are out of the frame. So I need some space to be able to move that up into. And to do that, we have to extend the canvas. And to do that, we come to Image, Canvas Size, right there. And where is my canvas size dialog? Image. Oh. Uh-oh, is my Photoshop, am I running too many things on between Zoom and Photoshop and Lightroom? Let's see. It's obviously still thinking about it. Come on, Photoshop, you can do it. Image. Hang on. All right, I apologize. Let me see if I can get Photoshop to wake up here. Always something with the tech. Let's see, are we still not? Image. No, it, I think, died. Let's see. Yeah, I've got nothing. So I am going to close Photoshop if I can and reopen it. We'll start over. Come on, close Photoshop. Boy, it is really, let's go into the task manager here. Photoshop.
It was all those things you were saying about Mac users, and we put a hex on you.
Is that what it is?
I don't know.
Because you guys never had this issue,
Nick,
right?
As you saw last time, Nick had the problem when we started talking about Lumenzia, and I told him Greg Benz was putting a spill on him. So
It's probably, I believe anything. Yeah, even is, I try to have the biggest, most powerful machine I can have. And when you're running so many different applications simultaneously and you're not on a Mac, apparently, that's what happens. Okay, so we're going to go back in, reopen these real quick, reopen Photoshop, and see if we can get back up and running again. I apologize for the slight delay in our programming. Oh, and of course,
no, I think it's actually part of the demonstration to bond you more to the people that aren't Photoshop instructors, because then you can see it happens even to the best of you.
Exactly. I like that. We'll go
Yeah.
with that. All right, we're back. Let's try this again. So I'm going to copy this guy. I'm going to paste him on top of there. I am going to go to image, canvas size. And for some reason, it is not giving me, it must be hiding somewhere. Love it when this happens. Can I do it from, yeah. I'm going to stop the share and see if it's just hidden somewhere that it's not showing up. I don't know where. Actually, maybe I don't even need to stop. Is it behind something? Is it going to?
Is it hiding on a different monitor or something? That somebody even said too.
Yeah, it's probably on a different monitor. Let me look on my other monitor over here. Of course, that has, let's see, so many things open on it. Is it over here? Let's see, let's hide that. Let's see here. No, that's Zoom. So many things. I am not seeing it. Oh, I found it. I have,
Where was
for anyone
it? So
wondering,
when it happens to us, we know where it is.
yeah, well, I'm running 3 monitors and it was on the least expected monitor. There it is. See, it wasn't my PC. It was me. It was operator error. It's not the Mac thing. I see you Mac guys.
Welcome
always
back. Yeah, exactly.
All right, we got it. Okay, so we're in canvas size dialog here, and I want to add some canvas up here in the sky. So when I move this up, I have some place to move it. So to do that in canvas size, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to change the height here. We're only going to work with height, not with width in this case. We only want to go up. We're going to change it to %. We're going to make sure that we have relative checked. And what % are we relatively going to move, extend up? I think, never know for sure, but I think around 30% usually does the trick. And also down here, the anchor right now for height, it's going to put 15% up and 15% down. And I don't want that. I want all 30% on the top. So I need to click down here so that that arrow is only pointing up. We're not doing any downward canvas extension. So now I can click OK, 30% relative, only up. And there it is. There's that extra canvas. So now when I move this guy up here to align it with the shoreline back there, I've got enough canvas to move it up. And I actually even have a little extra to work with, which we'll cut off later. And I want to get those shorelines exactly matched up. I think last time Nick showed how to use the difference blending mode that helps with that. This image, because we've got different content, doesn't exactly work great. The other thing you can do instead of the difference blending mode is just bring the opacity of that top layer down to about 50%. And then I zoom in. And then with the move tool, I can move around. I can see, there's those 2 shorelines. Let's get them as close as we can right in there. And I can even use the arrow keys to nudge them up and down 1 pixel at a time if I need to. And then once I've got the shorelines aligned, I can turn the opacity of that layer back up 100%. And we know that we're good to go there. Now, I need to next find where in the bottom frame is going to be the place where the transition happens, where we blend from the front frame to the back frame. Now, like we said, with this image, because I've got this nice straight flat shoreline, I can actually take the rectangular marquee tool right there and set the feathering to maybe like 3 pixels or maybe even 5 pixels, depends on, you can experiment with different amounts of feathering to this selection. And then starting outside the image, I'm going to just drag that down and try to get it lined up as close as I can to that shoreline somewhere in there. And now that I've got that selection for where I want the blend to happen, I can turn this layer back on. And all I need to do is add a layer mask to this top layer with that selection, and that mask will complete the merge. So this is the add a mask button down here. Go ahead and click that. There is that mask. And there we go. So we've got the properly sized mountains now blended on top of the proper foreground that I wanted. That looks much more like the scene that I experienced. And if we zoom in, and you can see it's close, but there's a difference in exposure times. One was a longer exposure, so there is a little difference in the water that we can see there. You might need to come into that mask with let's say like a black paintbrush or a white paintbrush at, you know, maybe a little lower flow, maybe like 40%, and kind of feather that out even more along there to get that to not be apparent what happened. But all in all, with a little bit of work, you can get that blend pretty good. And then at this point, I would again come to the crop tool. If I had a crop ratio set, I would hit clear, so that I'm now cropping, because I'm no longer in any fixed or known or normal standard aspect ratio, but I'm going to bring this down and crop to the edge of that and just crop off those unused pixels right there. And there we go. There is my focal length blended image. That's the simple version. If you get a version where you can just do it with that sort of rectangular selection, that's awesome. Go for it. Always go with the simplest thing that works and does a good job. But let's say we were in a situation where we didn't have a nice straight shoreline and water. What would we do? Well, let me go ahead and delete this mask, and we're going to start over. And this time, let me turn this off. Let's say that I want to actually have my merge happen right along where this line of rocks is. That's going to be my spot. I think that's going to look better, more natural. It might be a ridge line in another photo. It might be the edge of a river. It might be, you know, where there's a line of trees or bushes or something cutting across the scene. Finding that break point is kind of an art and a skill, and it's different in every photo. Then what you're going to do, once you've determined where that spot is, you're going to come up here and grab not the regular lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool. That is a mouthful. So with that lasso tool, what we can do, let me zoom in here just a little bit. We can start by clicking just outside the image out here. And then as I move along, it draws a straight line. And that's a really thin straight line. I hope you guys can see that in the video. And every place I click, it sets a marker or basically sticks it down. And then I can draw another straight line from there. And the shorter and shorter straight lines I can do, I can actually end up drawing very precise curved lines along this image. Now, across this area of water right here, there's really nothing to follow, no edge to follow. So I'm just going to go all the way across and deal with that later. But let's zoom in here so you can see if I want to come in at 200% and I can follow this exact edge of this rock. And the more precisely I do this, the better this will look on the other end. So if you can come along and really draw that boundary perfectly, but that also takes a long time. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. And if you want to move over, you hold down the shift key to get the hand tool. You can move the frame over, and then we release the shift. Now your selection tool will work again. Now to speed this up for time, this is going to look horrible, but just know that I wouldn't do it this fast, but I can click along here. And actually I want to cut that this metal post that was sticking out of the rock. I'm just going to not even include that, just leave it out. I don't need it. Not part of my photo. And so let's just do a quick job. So I'm going to start doing a very sloppy job of this, but just know that a more careful you are, the better it will look. All the way across these rocks, all the way down through here, cross over to these guys, up and around. Let's see, down to here. Almost done. Let's get this going fast. Sloppy. But you can get the idea of what we're going for here. And then I get outside on the other side. And now I'm going to do a control or command minus to zoom out while that tool is still functional. And now once I've zoomed out, I can now bring that around the outside of the whole image and back to my starting point. And when I get there, that will allow me to click and complete the selection. So this is a much more refined selection than our previous one, but also it's still not as refined as it could be. because those are edges we followed. And let's see, if I turn on this layer again, when it's off, and this layer is off, we don't have access to select and mask right here. But if I turn it on, it'll allow me to go to select and mask. Oh, actually, you know what? But then we're still seeing, I want to cancel out of that. Here's the other workaround. Well, you can either turn this off and just highlight the background layer here and then go to select and mask that way, or you can also just go up to select and mask, which is right here. That's the other way. Many ways to do anything in Photoshop. All right, so now I'm going to go to select and mask, and in select and mask, I can refine this edge and make it even better so that that blend will look even better. The first thing I usually do in here, well, first of all, is I zoom into 100%, and then I set the edge detection somewhere between 3 and 5. Let's try 3 for this. Whoops. Okay, go ahead and set 3 pixels, and that'll help it just kind of lock onto any of those edges a little more precisely. And then if I still have areas that look like, you know, I really messed up, let's see, like I know over here I got really sloppy. Yeah, there's some of the rock that I totally cut off here. This tool is the edge refinement tool. So if I get that and paint along here, it will hopefully find that edge a little better than my selection. And this is where the better your selection was to start with, the less of this you have to do. Let's see, is it finding that? No, I'm going to back up out of that. The other thing you can do is just get the regular paintbrush tool, and you can just paint along and add the parts of the selection. And like here where it overlapped in the rock, if I go to the minus, I can subtract these areas where the selection's coming into the rock. And again, with lots of fiddling and a little bit of time, that's kind of what Photoshop's about. Eventually you can get a really good selection. When you've got that really good selection, you're going to come down to output to selection and click OK. So now we've got a very refined, hopefully very refined selection to use for our mask. So now it's just like before when I made that rectangular selection. I come back up to the top layer, I turn it on, and with the selection active, I place a mask. The mask will be the selection, and it will complete that blend. But this is now a much more kind of realistic looking blend, I think. I think that looks really good, picking that zone. Now, it's not perfect yet. Part of what I can notice here is that my exposure values and my white balance between the two frames are slightly off. That's why we have the smart objects. So if I double click on the top smart object here, I can reopen the raw file in Camera Raw, accessing the original 16 or more than 16-bit raw data, all the original CR2 raw data from that. And I can say, I knew that needed to be a little brighter, that upper exposure, and I think slightly warmer, just a little bit. Somewhere, oh, let me back up, I don't remember what it was, 58, so maybe like 6,000, just warm it up slightly. And also I can still use those cool localized masks that that Michael was using. I can come into there and make a sky mask in Camera Raw and use that now to bring down the exposure in just the sky, and also maybe bring up the let's see, yeah, the dehaze, and that really kind of helps make the sky a little bit more dramatic.
Look at you go and bringing it all full circle.
All of it, bringing back the combo. And that's the great thing. One of the things that I absolutely love about smart objects in Photoshop is basically it's like you've got Photoshop and Lightroom all together in one application. You can do everything Photoshop can do, plus with those raw smart objects, you can do everything Lightroom can do. So it's really fun. Now, there's a little bit, I'm going to add actually a brush to this because I want to brush in where the Camera Raw sky selection didn't quite select what I wanted. So a little extra brushing looks good. So now when I click OK, we're going to let that update. And now the blend looks much better. I like the sky. I could go into the foreground raw smart object and do other adjustments in Camera Raw there. I would probably also zoom in and just see what this transition looked like. Along the rocks, where I made that very careful selection, looks great. Where I went straight across the water, that looks a little funky. So this is where you could come in with, I'd probably come in with a black brush. Whoops, sorry, brush black, maybe at like a 50% flow, and just kind of blend this little transition through there to make that not as obvious. And I could come over here, and any place else I felt like that transition was apparent, I can do a little hand feathering to that mask to blend and get it to all seamlessly come together. And then at this point, let's pretend that it came out of our camera that way, and we could go on doing creative developing to this image to finalize it. We could save it and import it back to Lightroom and do our further adjustments there if that's our comfort zone. So there is focal length blending, a simple one and a little bit more complex method. All right, any questions there?
No, only about 16 of them, but we'll a couple ones come through though. I think it's as you watch your work, a couple people have asked are you using a tablet or a Wacom tablet?
So I do have one. I don't know if am I up on screen? Can people see me? Does it matter if I look at the camera?
No, I don't. I think you're fine. We don't
like
okay.
It. Well, anyway, I do have one. I was going to show.
But
I have the same one that Nick showed last week. However, Nick uses his, I think, almost exclusively, like no mouse and almost no keyboard. At least that's what he tells me. I actually only use my tablet for painting style. So if I'm dodging and burning or doing things that are very painterly, I use it. But for everything else, I find that I just am faster with my keyboard and the mouse when I need to be precise, like I need to hover over like a single pixel and not have the point move and click on that exact pixel. I can do that better with a mouse than I can trying to hover and not shake my hand with a Wacom. So
got it.
That's me, but I do have one and I do love it for doing things like dodging and burning.
Yeah. So Gail asked to extend the canvas, or she said that she uses the crop tool and then unchecks delete crop pixels or to content aware fill areas.
Yep. That also works.
Same thing. So
yep.
Can you demonstrate?
Yeah, and that's
that
actually probably faster. Yeah, let's just do that. I didn't learn it that way, but yeah, if you have, unfortunately, this goes behind the zoom panel up here. Let me, so if we uncheck delete crop pixels, is that the right method here? And then stretch up. Yeah, there you go. Boy, that's super fast. So if you need to quickly crop tool, uncheck delete cropped pixels, and then you can extend the canvas to your heart's content that easily. That's a newer thing. I learned that back in the dark ages of Photoshop when extend canvas was the only way to do that.
Yeah.
Love it.
The only thing I think it's actually a really good suggestion. I like it. The only thing I would also caution on that is if you think you're going to be printing the print, by doing it the way Gail mentioned, you lose that precision of size of extending the canvas the way you did. But it's definitely a really good way to do this blending.
Yep.
Good suggestion. The other question was related to, do you ever do you ever stretch images? That was the question.
Good question. And again, I'm always kind of going to try to represent what my experience was, or maybe even, I don't know what anybody else's experience is, but I would hope that if somebody went to this place and stood there, that they would recognize it. So I'm not trying to make anything look like it didn't look, or, so fantastical that no one would know where that was. But again, with, if you didn't take 2 frames, instead you just had those small background mountains, you could stretch those, make a copy of the upper part of the image and enlarge that, and then blend that and get your larger mountains that way. Of course, when you do that, you're interpolating, you're adding pixels in, so you don't have as much leeway there because you're dealing with less pixel data when you stretch it like that. And even just with this one, I could come to this top layer and do a Control or Command T as a transform. Oh, before I did this, I need to unlink the pixels from the mask with the little chain. I need to uncheck that, because what I don't want to do is stretch the mask. I only want to stretch the pixels. But here, yeah, if I wanted to grow my mountains that way, and stretch them up, even make them look a little bigger. I can certainly do that. But again, what would be my goal would be to make it feel right and to me, right to me. But you could do it for whatever goal is your goal.
So I tell people our eyes see the world at approximately a 35 millimeter focal length. And so if you're stretching an image beyond what you would see realistically with a 35 millimeter lens, then you're obviously distorting. So
and that's what these mountains were when I photographed them. I didn't know I was taking it at 35, but when it looked right to me, it ended up that it was 35 millimeters.
Yeah, I support your concept on stretching, because I think I've played around with stretching before and then been really unhappy with my work. So which is good. Mario asked, besides mountains, can you give a few more ideas of when you would use focal length blending?
Well, anytime, I would say anytime you want something very wide angle in the foreground. Erin Bobnick has really made those Death Valley mud cracks famous. She's photographing those with an 11 millimeter lens to get that really cool arcing mud crack pattern. And then whatever's in the background. So it could be buildings, it could be a city skyline, it could be, trees in the distance, like in the Palouse, if there were some a lone tree out there, but it's a dot. The hills and the tree on the hill might all be good for a focal length blend like that. But really, focal length is all about things in the distance and things in the foreground and kind of merging those together. So it really is, in my experience, most useful when you're trying to do a wide angle foreground and something in the distance has become too small.
Great. Couple questions. One was related to the why you wouldn't use the magic lasso. Another person asked, why wouldn't you use the pen tool to do that blend?
So in Photoshop, a million ways, or not a million, but several ways to do almost anything. And that's always, why wouldn't you do this? Why wouldn't you do that? The answer is I can only demonstrate one at a time. For me, the pen tool, or sorry, the magnetic lasso, like along here, unless you've got really obviously defined, sharp edges, it has trouble finding, edges that are less well defined, like I have here. So that's that reason. And the pen tool you can also use, it basically functions the same as the polygonal lasso tool, except for you have the ability to add Bezier curves into it. So if you have something and you know how to use that tool and make those curves, great. I find that just making a lot of little clicks, I don't need the curves. And it's just faster with the lasso tool. The pen tool, once you create a pen path, which to me takes longer in the first place, then you still have to convert that path into a selection. It's not automatically a selection, so it's kind of an extra step. But does it work? Works great. And if you know how to use the pen tool, go for it.
Yeah, good answer. Okay. One of the questions as you're getting ready for the next one, which I know the answer to, but is, do you use smart objects whenever you can?
I do. And I think Nick covered this pretty well last time too, is that, yeah, if I have the opportunity to open up raw smart objects into Photoshop, then I do, because they basically give me all the power of both programs, Lightroom or Camera Raw and Photoshop all in one, and I can use them interchangeably. It's really great. And it also gives me access back to all of that raw information. So if I screwed up the white balance, or if I screwed up the clarity or something in Lightroom, I can go back and undo it. Whereas if I open it as a non-smart object and realize I overdid one of those things, it's really hard to impossible once you've rasterized it into the pixels to back it out. That said, there are certain things that you can't do with smart objects. We found that the auto aligning and auto blending doesn't work. You can't do a lot of the filters up here in the filter menu with smart objects. You can't do a lot of the cloning and healing and that kind of stuff with smart objects. So in those situations, you're kind of stuck. You at some point have to leave the smart object behind.
Okay. All right, well, let's roll on to the next one, and then we'll definitely save some
Okay.
time for some of these other questions.
Sounds good. Let's get out of here. Okay. So the next, here's move Lightroom all over the place. The next one we're going to talk about here is perspective blending. And this first one I'm going to do, I think, is something that maybe a lot of people are pretty familiar with already. So I can go through it pretty fast. And actually, it's very automated, which is nice. So perspective, we talk about the camera's perspective. In this situation, I was looking at a great scene. I wanted this reflection to come right down here in between the rock and the shoreline. There was stuff over here and over here that I didn't want. I wanted to crop that out so it's vertical. The problem is that my camera in this perspective with that lens and focal length, I couldn't get the whole thing in one frame. So this perspective is only the bottom part of the image. If I tilt the camera up, now the camera has a different perspective. New perspective, it's the middle part of the frame. I still didn't get the top part. So I had to tip up one more time to get the top part of the frame. And if you'll notice, like here's this rock and branch, there they are here in the middle. So I'm overlapping by about a third to give enough pixels for the software to figure out what should line up with what. And same thing, here's this branch up here, that overlaps, there it is there. So keeping enough pixel overlap between your frames, and then also really trying to rotate that camera up vertically without letting it tip side to side or get out of axis. And there are, of course, fancy ball heads and things that you can use that help you do that and keep it all nice and straight. I don't carry those when I go backpacking. I actually don't carry them anywhere. I just do a careful job on my ball head and it works. All right, so I want to stitch this. I think a lot of people are familiar with panning your camera right to left and stitching those into a panorama. Well, this is up and down. It's a vertorama. It's a vertical panorama. The cool thing is that whether you're doing a horizontal panorama, a vertical panorama, or if you're doing a full grid, like if you're one of those people that likes to photograph the entire half of the night sky to get the Milky Way arcing from, east to west entirely, and that big arc of Milky Way across the entire frame, you're going to be shooting like a whole grid or rows of frames, getting those stacked together. Whatever you're doing, it's all the same procedure. Photoshop does do this, but Lightroom and Camera Raw now do it better. So I don't use Photoshop for this anymore. I do this from Lightroom. So all you need to do, again, this is a thing that works with raw smart objects, or actually not even smart objects, just raw files, because we're doing this all in Lightroom here with raw data, is without making any adjustments. I haven't done any adjustments yet because we can do all of these later. Select your frames, your perspective frames, and then right click and come to Photo Merge Panorama. Go ahead and click on that. Oops, and that went over to my other monitor. It's funny where it's putting things.
I don't know how to respond.
And now my watch is talking to us. We've got all kinds of tech craziness going on. All right, so here is the Panorama Photo Merge in Lightroom, the dialog. You've got 3 different projection models to choose from. One's called spherical, one's called cylindrical, one's called perspective. Depending on how many frames you took and how wide angle the lens was and a variety of other things, usually one of these is better than the other ones. So I just find the one that I like the best. In this case, it is cylindrical just because it's a little bit wider. And it automatically warps the different frames to get them to line up. And it does an amazing job these days. This technology keeps getting better. We've got some edges out here that I could crop them off. If I just wanted to crop them, that's what the auto crop box is. I could fill in the edges. This is like a content aware fill that just fills in the edges. And that can work really well sometimes. But sometimes it doesn't. If you've got detailed things that it doesn't do a good auto content aware. The other thing you can try is the boundary warp. And that actually warps the boundary edges outwards and tries to create a proper alignment, and depends on the image, but a lot of times, and in this image particularly, I think just doing the boundary warp does it. So I didn't have to fill anything. I didn't have to crop anything. I just warped in those edges. To me, that's what looks good on this image. Different for every image. The auto settings here, all that does is it, in the Camera Raw development settings, kind of pre-decides how it's going to auto set it for you. You can go ahead and check that, because later you can undo those or tweak those, whichever you want. Create a stack basically will take this stitched panorama and stack it with the 3 images that were used to make it, so that in Lightroom it's all just in one stack in Lightroom. If you want to do that, you can. I'm not going to do that right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit merge and see what it does. And what it does is it, up here thinking, creates that merged panorama. There it is. There's the full scene as I intended it. And over here, you can see here are the settings, the auto settings that it made. And if I didn't like those, you know, if I want to, because this is a DNG file. So this has almost the same amount of data as the original raw frames did. And that's what's so cool about this, is it's still a mostly raw file. So I can still completely work with my white balance. I can work with my highlights and my shadows and my blacks and do all that cool stuff and all the things you can do, and go in and use the mask and everything that you would normally do to a raw file, you can do to this file with pretty much the same performance. And then if at some point you did want to go work on it further in Photoshop, you can open it up and edit in Photoshop as well. So that, for doing those kinds of perspective blends, whether it's a panorama, vertical panorama, or even like a multi-road megapixel stitch, that's the way I go with that now. Now, what about Camera Raw? Camera Raw is basically the same thing. You would need to open up all 3 frames from Bridge, or however you get your raw files into Camera Raw. If you're not a Lightroom user, then you would select those frames in Camera Raw, right click on them, and it's panorama, photo merge to panorama. The controls look essentially the same. So whatever it is that you use, you can do it. So that's that. So that's a really simple kind of format for perspective blending, because it's been so automated for us. Let's look at another perspective blend that is not so automated. So this is a scene in Acadia National Park from a few years ago when I was there. And I loved this morning sunrise light that we had that morning. I loved how it was making this rock formation glow. It was, you know, angled right where the sun was coming up. Just was beautiful. But where I could stand to get this in my foreground, the headland, the point of land back here, overlaps and hides behind the rocks. And that is a perspective I don't like. You know, to me, this isn't an image that I enjoy because of that. Now, if I had had a ladder or a really tall tripod and a remote control or a drone, I could have probably gone up a few feet and had the same or similar foreground, and also separated that point back there so that I could see more of it and it wasn't overlapping the way it is. I didn't have that with me. I didn't have that opportunity, but that's how I could have potentially changed the camera's perspective and gotten it all in a single frame. What I could do, though, was take this frame and then walk around the rocks and stand over here where I'm closer to the edge and take another frame that I do see all of that not overlapping out here. And so 2 completely different camera positions, 2 different camera perspectives to try to create the image that I think I want. Perspective blending, let's see how that looks. So again, raw files, I did do some initial adjusting just to kind of try to set up similar color value and exposure and white balance and that kind of stuff. But I don't know that I got them matched well, but doesn't matter. I'm going to open Smart Objects so I can fine tune that later. Select them both, just like we did with the past example of this guy right here. We're just going to open them as Smart Objects, edit in Photoshop as Smart Objects. And here we are. Okay. So just like the other one, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to stack them. I'm going to put the top frame on the top layer. So I need to Controller Command C to copy, go to the bottom frame, Controller Command V to paste. And now I've got them as smart objects layered together, and I can close this guy over here. Don't need that one anymore. Okay, so here we are. Now the procedure here is very similar to focal length blending. What I need to do is figure out, first I have to extend the canvas. We're going to use the the person who suggested we do it this way. Do I still have this unchecked? I do. Okay, so we can just extend this up this way. Awesome, super fast. I like that. Thank you. I'm going to use that from forever now. All right, so we've extended up the canvas, so I have a place to move this up to, because if we'll see, well, actually, in this case, the horizons are in the same place, but that's the problem. I don't want the horizon here behind these rocks. I want it up above those rocks. So I am going to be moving up. I just don't know how far yet. I'm going to turn off that top layer, because the next thing we need to do is find that place, that blending zone, just like we did in the focal length perspective, where that can make a seamless transition. And this doesn't work with every one of these. You may run into scenes where you just can't find the perfect place to make that break. But in this one, I'm going to use my polygonal lasso again and zoom in a bit here. Let's go, let's see. Yeah, let's get in here. And I'm going to start, I think this line along the rocks is what I'm going to choose. I'm going to artificially cut out all these trees, because trying to select around those trees is a pain anyway. You could potentially do it. I've tried it. I didn't have a lot of success. I had better success this way. So I'm going to start right out here. Remember, like I said, if I zoomed way in and was very careful about clicking along and really following this edge as carefully as I could, then I can get really great results. For our timeline here, let me zoom out quite a ways and go quickly. So if I click along here, following this rock line, I'm going to come right under this guy. This is Chris Smith, who's from the Out of Chicago organization. If anybody knows Chris, he's all blurry anyways. I don't want him in my photo. Here's another blurry person right there who was moving during my long exposure. Let's see, I'm going to come down along this rock line here and along here, all the way along. Go as fast as I can, but if I do it too sloppy, it will look really bad, so I don't want to do that. Oh, here's a rock climber who is just getting ready to go rock climbing at sunrise off the edge of this cliff. I'm going to cut him all off except for his feet. I'd have to come back and clone those out later. Down here, all the way along, whoops, down to here, up to here. Let's go. I'm doing a very sloppy job. I know none of you would do such a sloppy job as this. A few minutes of your time is worth the good results. Fortunately, time is a premium all the way to the outside, then Controller Command minus to zoom out so I can see all the way around. Click up here, cross, back down to my starting point. There's my selection. Come down to the layer that's visible, highlight that, go to Select and Mask, refine that edge just like we did before. Let's give it 3 pixels. I could zoom in on it, and if I really wanted to get in and fix these places where I was sloppy, I could use the Refine Edge tool and try to paint along there and see if Photoshop can find those little gaps and things. So I'd be very careful about doing all of that. And then when I'm done, output to selection. So now there's that refined selection. Come back to the top layer, turn it on, add a mask. Okay, cool. I've done the merge, but as we knew, my point is still behind from that vantage point. So I need to uncheck the mask so I don't move the mask, come over to the pixels with the move tool, and now I can move those pixels up until they are where I think they should go. Maybe somewhere in there, let's say. I don't know if that's exactly right, but we'll try it. Now you notice as I moved it up, my other foreground started coming into the scene. So I need to do some more work on this mask to mask that out. Now to do that, I'm going to Control or Command click on the mask to reload my selection that I had made. And this is a selection actually that I may want to use multiple times. So anytime I have done a selection that took me a long time to make like that, I often come to the channels panel down here. And with that selection loaded, I click the new alpha channel button right there. And so now what that's done is that saved that selection as an alpha channel. So I can come back and get it later if I need it. Okay, so that's there. We know that's there. Now with that selection, I can paint with a black paintbrush through this area. And what that'll enable me to do, let me get up to full flow, is I can mask out that wrong foreground through there, but I'm not masking into any place I don't want to, overlapping, which actually in this case, because it's already black, doesn't matter, but this will come in a minute. You'll see why I have that selection. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to keep masking up until I fully get rid of those rocks. And if I see, oh, there's a difference in the watercolor, so maybe I should keep on blending up. Well, at some point, I start masking in the background of the bottom layer, that same point, which I don't want. So now I need to switch back to a white brush. And this is why I have the selection. So here I can now paint back without painting back over these rocks. And somewhere in here, I'm going to try to find a merging point that looks as good as possible. Maybe something like that. Still not perfect. So I'll show you how we're going to deal with that next. But now I can deselect that selection. And so that looks much more like the scene that I envisioned when I was there, the image that I wanted to take. But we can do some other things with this. This is a smart object. We can do a smart warp to this, because you'll notice I've got trees leaning out over here and kind of things tipping off this side. So I'm going to do a Control or Command T for free transform. And I'm just transforming this layer. The link is unchecked, so I'm not going to transform the mask. And up here behind the zoom controls, which I knew how to make those go somewhere else. There probably is a way, but I don't know how. Well, anyway, I'll just pull this down. I am going to go, here is the button that I can enter warp instead of free transform. So I entered free transform, and then now I went to warp, and this will enable me to warp this and get the perspective of that shoreline and the trees going up and down, looking more like how they're supposed to look. And then, whoops, now I got to go back out of warp, back to free transform. And now with free transform, I can just drag this over until it's out of the frame like that. And I can commit to that. And that looks much better now. And then the other thing is I need to fix this issue in the water down here. The blend where I'm coming up from this frame to this frame, this up here needs to be lighter. It needs to be a little pinker. So this is where I can come into the raw smart object. And let's see, I'll probably just do this with a mask really quickly. So I'm going to the masking area, grab a radial gradient, stretch this out, all just down in this area that needs to be adjusted. And I'm just going to do what I said. I'm going to lighten it. And in color, I'm going to make it a little more magenta and maybe a little more yellow. And I don't know if that's going to be a great match, but let's find out. So, oh, and the other thing I want to do actually is I want to work with this sky a little bit. So I'm going to add another new mask. This one's going to be the Select Sky mask. Because again, I want to work with this sky independently a little bit. I want to bring up the blacks a la David Kingham, maybe bring up the shadows a little bit, bring up the overall exposure, bring down the highlights, maybe bring up the saturation in that sky a little bit, something like that. I don't know if that's perfect. That's quick. Okay, so those two adjustments, let's see how that looks back in the blend. Thinking about it, there it is. Yeah, so closer. Still didn't get it quite light enough here, so I could go back in the raw smart object, keep working with that. I could come into this raw smart object and also work with the adjustments in this part of the frame. Oh, my mask has got some rocks showing through there. So I need to go back to a black brush here, make sure I don't have any rocks showing at all. But anyway, I would keep going back and forth until I got a really good match there. And then at this point, just like in all the other ones, I would say, let's pretend it came out of the camera this way. And I would go on with my, my creative image developing either in Photoshop or Lightroom. So that is perspective blending. Lots of stuff. Nick, do we want to do any quick perspective blending questions, or should we press on to the final one?
One of them is kind of, it's an interesting one because you talked earlier about different perspectives than one you would see if a location was visited. I mean, what are you thinking now? Because a person asked, are you now not creating a different perspective that one could not view if the location was visited?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. And this is where it comes down to what is your, don't do it if you don't like the idea of that. But if you feel like this is a creative communication of the scene that you want to create, this is how you would do it. So I'm not saying whether or not you should. It's just, and for this, like I said, for me, this one, to me, this is the scene that I was envisioning when I was there. And I went back and forth several times. I'm like, from over here, I can't see the point of land. And from up there, I don't like the foreground. I want this image to look like this. How could I do that? Boy, if I had a ladder and climbed the ladder, that might do it. I don't have that. So do I just not take the photo? Do I take a photo that I don't like? What do I do? In this case, I decided, this is the image I want to take. And it does represent the scene that I was able to know was there when I was there. For me, that felt okay for me. But I would say if it doesn't, then don't.
No, I think it's a great answer. And I think it iterates the point of don't hide behind, if you're, whatever decisions you make, don't hide behind them and try to deceive people, which nobody's doing in this case, but also how do you want to portray the scene, right? So like, for example, if you weren't in a national park area and you could fly a drone, you could have created an image that's exactly like this from a different perspective. And so I applaud your vision personally, and being able to see the scene and what you want to portray, not, oh yeah, I took this image 6 years ago and I'm blending in a moon I took when I was 12 with the foreground of a sunset in California. And that's not nature photography, but this really feels like it. So I like the question.
Cool.
Like the answer. Alpha channel versus safe selection work equally well, question mark?
Save selection. Yeah, they're the same thing. It just saves the selection as an alpha channel. So two different, again, in Photoshop, two different ways to accomplish the exact same thing.
Yeah. The step where he needed to get rid of the rocks in the foreground, what did he do with the mask to turn it back on?
To turn it back on. Or did I show what the mask looked like? I don't remember.
Yeah.
I don't remember that step. I don't remember what I did. But a mask, if you want to view a mask, you can hold down Alt or Option and click the mask, and that'll show you the mask. And then you can actually paint on the mask right there. I could paint on the mask. So Alt or Option, click on the mask to view a mask or the image, but flip back and forth. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it could be, or if not, they can message me and we can re-message, re-ask the question. Last question on this one, and then I don't know if you had one other demonstration or if we just want to kind of do questions, was what would the process be if you're doing multiple tiered panorama, several rows and several images per row?
So say it again. You broke up just a little bit there for me.
Yeah, sorry. Doing multiple tiered panoramas, several rows and several images per row.
So in terms of the stitching, it would look exactly like what I did with the vertical panorama with the tree. You would select all of the frames in all of your rows. And the easiest way, there are other ways to do it that would be more difficult, but for me, I would just in Lightroom do the merge to panorama, and it figures out how to place all of those as long as you have enough overlap, and then how to, how it's going to bend all of those different frames and stitch them all together. And it'll stitch rows just as well as it'll stitch a single row.
Yeah, I have multiple 15 image drone panoramas from 1,500 feet up in crazy winds that are stitched together into large format prints in my head. I can't get over how good of a job it does. So
Nice.
great.
Well done. Yeah, I haven't done anything like that, but glad to know that actually works at that extreme edge of the technology. Awesome.
Exactly. All right. So we have the request for please do the last of the 4 kinds of blending. So we still
Yep.
have enough time to, so.
Yeah, we totally have enough time to do this last one and probably answer quite a few more questions as well, because this one's going to go fast. Let me close this out because this is very similar to what Nick was showing us in the last one, and this is exposure blending. Now, Nick wasn't using multiple exposures. He was double processing a single raw exposure and then blending those together. But they're really the same thing, except for it just gives you even more dynamic range to work with. So for example, let's use this example. Here's a photo where to try to get any shadow detail at all down here in the foreground in the canyon of Smith Rock State Park here in Oregon, I totally blew out the sky. You know, there's stuff up here in the sky that no matter what in this area and some of the colors, it's just in these clouds, there's just nothing there to recover. So that's not a sky I want to use. So I took a separate, and that's what I mean. So I couldn't get this in one exposure. The dynamic range for the camera I had just couldn't do it. Actually, the camera I have now probably could do this because it has more dynamic range, but no matter what, you eventually in nature will run into a situation where the dynamic range is beyond what current cameras can do. And so you've got to shoot more than one exposure. And in this case, I was able to do it with just 2. So here's an exposure where the sky is properly exposed. Now, if I tried to recover these shadows down here to, you know, just make one image out of that, I don't know if you guys can see this. Oh, and this probably even has, anyway, it's so noisy in the shadows that is not the quality that I would want to use for that. So to get a good final image with great quality and color throughout, that's also the proper tonal balance throughout, bracketed 2 exposures, one where I'm clipping shadows, but not the highlights, another one where I'm clipping highlights, but not the shadows. And now without making any adjustments other than chromatic aberration and that kind of stuff, I am going to, oh, and I just want to say, I wish we had more time. I should use, and if we have time, I'll try to do a quick one. Several people did submit these kinds of blending examples, exposure blends. I didn't get examples of any of the other kinds, which is why I've been using mine. But let me just do this one really quick because I know how it works. So I'm just going to, again, open as smart objects. That process is the same. Oh, let me get Photoshop expanded here. Okay. Now, again, we've got them in 2 separate documents. So I'm going to copy this top one. That's the dark one I usually like to put on top. You don't have to, but that's the way I do it. And this is really, really, really critical in all of these kinds of blends, but especially, actually not all of them. Those other ones where we were moving the 2 frames, if they didn't line up, that was fine. In fact, that was kind of the whole point. They didn't line up. For an exposure blend, we need the frames to line up. So if your tripod has moved or you tried to handhold this, it's going to be much more difficult, especially because we can't do an auto alignment with smart objects, and we really need the smart objects for this to work. So here's the process. The first thing I need to do is check if they line up. And in this case, they do. I could zoom into 100%, and I could do like Nick did, the difference to see. And with the move tool, it looks like maybe there's a slight misalignment. Let's see, yeah, a couple of pixel move with the arrow keys. I think I got them a little closer, so that might help. But anyway, make sure they're in alignment is number 1. Number 2 is to create the blending mask. And usually for this kind of blending, and Nick showed a bunch of ways to do this. So if you have access to his, go back and look, and you can see a lot of ways of doing this. In my outline, I include 3 different ways. One is with, in Photoshop, you can go to select sky and just have it make a sky selection for you. That's the easiest way. Doesn't always do a great job. You can do it the way Nick did and use luminosity selections that you modify to make a mask that's white in the sky, black in the land. That's what you're going for. You can also do blend if. So if I don't know if you're familiar with how to do blend if you come up to, actually, if you just double click on a layer, it'll open up the same window. And that window is the layer style window, and you can use blend if you know how to use blend if. So all of those can work in this situation. I'm going to use the fast one. I have explanations how to do the other ones in there. Now let's see. So I'm just going to come to select sky and have Photoshop create a sky selection for me. And I'm just curious here to see, yeah, looks like it did a pretty good job. If I wanted to, I could go into select and mask and refine it some, but for time, we're just going to use that sky selection. And I'm just going to add.
And there's no need to rush, Sean. I mean, we can definitely go over, especially since we lost a little bit of a blip with the tech issues, et cetera.
Okay. Yeah. If people are, have a little extra
they
time,
can drop out, they can catch it. If they need to drop right at 6, they can catch it, but
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
But this part, making that selection is easy. It's sky selection, but there's other ways to do it. If the sky selection in Photoshop, the auto sky selection doesn't work. But then once you've got that sky selection, same thing again, you're just going to make a mask. And that mask is going to be the blending zone. So if we take a look, there's that mask, and we can see here some places where it kind of went up into the sky or down in the land. Didn't get it perfect, but we'll see how it does. So that's the initial blend. Not bad. It's close. But you notice it looks a little unnatural back here, and also we don't, really dark down here in the foreground. That's why we have these raw smart objects. So to get the blend to complete, now with that mask, we just open up each raw smart object independently. And the goal here is to make raw adjustments, which I hadn't made any yet. So now I'm going to make, and my goal for this is pretend if this was the only frame I have, I've only photographed this one exposure, what would I do to try to make this look as good as I could? So I would definitely bring the highlights down. I would bring the blacks up, probably bring the shadows up a little bit, or using some of David Kingham's methods, use the curve instead to work with some of that tonality. Might bring, let's see, the overall exposure down. I'm trying to get the sky. Of course, there's those places I can't bring back, but bring the shadows up a little bit more, maybe something like that. And also, if I wanted to try to bring some more color into that foreground, I could bring up saturation, or I think David showed how to, or maybe it was Michael, I can't remember, showed how to come into the calibration tab and bring up the primary blue saturation, add a little more color down into that area, whatever method you like. Okay, let's say that's as good as this could have been as a single frame image. And I'm just going to say, okay, and let that update. And what that does is it updates the foreground, but because of the mask, it didn't change the sky. So if we take a look here, we're replacing that overexposed sky with a properly exposed sky, but I can also come into the upper smart object and do the same thing there. And the reason why we're doing this is, let me get out of here just so I can explain. Is that we're going to use all of the sky pixels for the sky. Those are really good quality pixels I exposed for the sky. We're going to use all of the land pixels for the land. Those are really good pixels because I exposed for the land. The place where we care is this transition zone. And you can probably even see there's a little bit of haloing going on in places. Well, actually, it's pretty good in this image. But what I want is this transition, like where these mountains look a little funky in the background here, to blend better, just in that transition zone. And that's what doing this process with the smart objects does, is it gets those transition zones to blend better. So I'm going to open up that top layer. And here's where I'm going to make this. If this was the only one I had, the only frame I had, definitely need to bring up the shadows and the blacks and probably the overall exposure, but bring down the highlights to keep what's going on in the sky looking good there, somewhere in there. Again, I might bring up a little bit of more saturation in the sky, but then that pumped up my blues too much. So I could come into the color mixer and come to saturation and pull the blue saturation down, and maybe also the blue luminance down there to get my sky looking as good as I can. And, whatever other kinds of adjustments you think you need to make in there. I might also want to bring my white balance of that sky a little warmer, maybe a little more magenta, somewhere in there. I don't know. And then when I say, okay, we let the mask combine those two iterations of the exposures. And I would keep working with this back and forth until I felt like that blend was really good. Obviously, I went to magenta in some of the clouds. And I think another thing I would do with this bottom exposure instead, to be even a little more crafty with that, is I would not bring up the shadows quite so much, or maybe even the overall exposure quite so much, and instead come into masking and use a radial gradient to actually add more of kind of like a bit of a spotlight down here in the foreground. So bring that up, maybe bring a little contrast in, bring the whites up a little bit, and maybe the saturation just in that area a little bit, and then just have that be kind of more like a spotlight down in that foreground, something like that. So that is an exposure blend. What you're trying to do is create that blending mask and then adjust the two exposures, making raw adjustments to those to get them to blend really well. If we zoom in and look, you'll see that I've got a few little issues with my mask, again, because of that select sky mask. A luminosity mask would do a little better, but for the most part, this just looks really good. Even these little trees right along the skyline, everything looks really nice and natural. Let's see how we do over there. Definitely working, oops, sorry, with that exposure to get this transition zone to blend a little bit. And as Nick showed, if I wanted to, I could come in with a white brush here. Let me find my white brush, and at a low opacity or low flow, even feather that mask out a little bit more to get that to look even a little more natural back in there and no halos. So that is exposure blending with two different exposures. And that is the fourth type of blending. Woo! You there, Nick?
Congratulations, you made it.
I made it under the time limit. And I would love to show that same procedure really quickly if we have about 2 minutes before we go to questions, with an example from an image that someone submitted, just so we can see.
Yeah, no, it's great.
process.
I think for those of you that need to go cook dinner because it's now almost 6, you get the recording later to watch this last bit, but stick around. If Sean's going to give a little more of his time, I think we'll gladly stick around.
Okay, so let's look at. So here are a few of these images that were submitted by users. This one was submitted by Gary Johnson, and so he did the exposure bracketing thing. Unfortunately here, so he's got light exposure for the foreground, sky is on the edge of being overexposed up there, and here's this sky exposure, the dark foreground. Unfortunately, if you'll notice, his tripod moved, and it moved quite a lot. If this was just a few pixel move, then nudging those into alignment would be possible. Unfortunately here, that amount of move, because it didn't just move in one axis, whatever his camera did moved in a couple axes, which is really, really hard to manually align. And because we would need smart objects, we can't use auto align. So I tried this. It's kind of possible, but not really. So not allowing your tripod or your camera to move between exposure frames is really, really important. However, in this case, this is one of those cases where I don't necessarily think that exposure blending is needed. Because if you look here, we're not clipping any highlights, and we're really not clipping blacks either. So I don't know what camera this was. I could go to the metadata, but I think it's a more recent camera. If I do shadow recovery here and bring up the exposure and bring up the blacks, or go back to the way David was showing us if you can, because his method of this is really great. But I still have highlight recovery I can do, and I think I can get this all well within frame. And if we zoom in, that amount of shadow recovery actually did not create noise or quality issues. So this is one of those things where why exposure blend if you've got it all in one exposure? So I think that one still works just fine. Let's go to this example. So this example from Claire has 3 exposures of these cool little cabins on piers and some wave motion. We've got one exposure where we're not really clipping highlights, but pretty dark. And then we've got a couple of lighter exposures. And And so let's try this one here. And I think when I did it, let's see, I was going, these two are almost the same. Well, this one's a little lighter. I would use for the foreground the lightest exposure because those are going to be the best pixels for that area. This one's going to be darker, or sorry, for the sky. Don't think we need this middle exposure. And I actually kind of like this wave motion in this one anyway. So let's try opening those as smart objects in Photoshop and see if we can do a real quick blend of these. Now, this one's a little trickier because, whoops, and I want to close if it's not, let's see. Yeah, let's close that guy. We don't want that there. Okay, what do we have? Okay. This one's a little trickier because we've got these buildings poking up across the skyline, and we've also got ocean. We've got all kinds of things. That's going to make this, I think, a real challenge. I'm going to put the dark one, so copy and paste, put the dark one on top of the light one. And now we need to find a selection that will allow us to do this blend. And I think this is the problem here. If we do select sky, Photoshop knows the difference between sky and ocean. So it selects the sky fine, but it has not selected the ocean for us. So this is where we might want to go instead to a luminosity selection to see if we could get a better selection that included the buildings and this. But on the other hand, I actually think the sky, or sorry, the ocean exposure, let me see, from underneath, oh, it is pretty blown out. But I don't know, we might be able to recover it. Let's go with this and see if that works. So I'm going to go ahead and add that Photoshop sky selection as a mask. And this may or may not work. And we see we're already bringing in the sky around those buildings. That looks pretty good. Now that we've got that mask on there. Oh, and yeah, the Photoshop did select a little bit of the ocean, but not much. Right, now let's see what happens if we do our blending trick. So I'm going to open up this one and make it look as good as I can. As if it were the only one that I had. You know, what white balance would I want here? Let's see, let's just see how do white balance look like, daylight. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, we'll get it looking, let's say that's, if I had this one exposure to work with, it would look like that. Let's go ahead and update that. And now same on the bottom one. Let's make this look as best we can as if it was the only one we had. So I'm going to bring the exposure down, bring the highlights way down. Trying to get this ocean to look like it's going to match the ocean in the other exposure better. Let's see if I can bring up the shadows in this foreground. Blacks a little bit, something like that. Let's say that's, might be able to bring the overall exposure down a little bit more. Let's see how that merges now. Yeah, actually not too bad. So there it is. I think that looks pretty good. Let's zoom in and see how we did. Now this image is a little out of focus anyway. That's just the focus of the image. So can't really work with that. But I would say the blend, boy, around the buildings, around all these legs, even from the sky down into the ocean and then into the rock, really good. Looks excellent. So that technique is very consistent, works well like that in just about every situation. And at 6:04, let's call that good, and let's do a little more Q&A if you want.
Sounds great. Yeah, a lot of questions came in about what about HDR in Lightroom and then using local adjustments.
Absolutely. So, yes, you can do photo merge to HDR in Lightroom or in Camera Raw now. And that does an amazingly great job. The original HDR software that came out, 15, 20 years ago, whatever that was, really was challenged. And so exposure blending like this, to me, was always the obvious choice. But the photo merge to HDR in Lightroom and Camera Raw does a really good job. And so if you've got enough data to deal with, so like most of my exposure blends can be done with 2 frames or maybe 3, whereas it really wants you to bracket more frames, like one stop apart kind of thing, and have 4 or 5 to work with. You can do it, I think, with 2, but you get better results the more data you can give it. So you got to have that first of all. Second of all, if you've got stuff moving around, tree branches moving, waves moving, clouds moving, it does have some challenges with that. And it has some functionality where you can try to de-ghost it. But I find what it ends up doing is just taking really bad pixels from the wrong exposure. So they end up all noisy and weird looking. So if I want ultimate control over the color, the exposure value, the white balance, the various adjustments separate in the 2 layers and complete control over how those are blending together, it's more work, but I can still have more control in Photoshop. But a lot of times I'll try the merge to HDR first. And if I get, again, I go with what's easy. If I get what I think is perfect result, then I'll go with that because it's definitely easier. Oh, and the other thing is really, really high dynamic range situations, like shooting directly into the sun. Again, the merge to HDR has some challenges in those situations as well.
Good, great answer. So I like this question. Rita asked, what instances would a halo be not so bad to keep around?
You mean, so like a blending halo, an edge halo?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both of what you were talking about.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, it would be if there was some artistic creative reason that it, whatever it is that you're trying to communicate, that halo really does do that. Or if there were some sort of natural light halo situation in the scene anyway, that you were trying to kind of bring out or enhance. But in most cases, to me, what halos that aren't intentional or aren't natural do for me is my eye goes directly to them and immediately I can see what the photographer did. And I want my developing to be invisible, indiscernible. I don't want people to look and think about the developing. I want them to look at the image. And so if I see a little edge halo along a skyline, where the mask didn't quite line up right, or if somebody did kind of just freehand blending and there's paintbrush halos going out into the sky or dark halos coming down to the mountain, I immediately go, oh, I see what they did, because it catches my eye, doesn't look seamless. And then I think about their developing.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I like the question. I was like, I like the answer. It's a good, valid question. Question that came in that I've been asked a lot too. Do you clean out people at the end after you've done all your blending or before you blend? Great
question. I have a whole course on smart objects and how to deal with this problem, because that's one of the issues when you're using smart objects in blending. They have a lot of advantages, but the disadvantage is you can't clone. Well, you can clone, but you can only clone with Lightroom or Photoshop's cloning tools, which are getting better. So yeah, my first option is to try to clone out things in Lightroom or Camera Raw using this healing tool. And if it looks great and does a good job, then I'm good. I don't have to worry about it in Photoshop. If I can't do a good job with this and I absolutely need Photoshop's cloning prowess, yeah, I do everything else but the cloning part. Get all the blend done, get all the adjusting done, or actually not all the adjusting. The raw adjusting I get done, not the Photoshop adjusting. I get all my raw adjustments done, get the blend done, get everything looking perfect, and then I rasterize and merge those smart objects. I can't go backwards now, but now I can go in on that pixel layer in Photoshop and do the kind of cloning that I need to do, and then move on from there.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll plan to wrap up in less than 5 or less, because we definitely have plenty of questions, but we also
speed round.
Exactly. With TK filters, can't you adjust both layers in Photoshop? Because you were going back and forth and adjusting one layer and then adjusting the other layer, and Barbara was asking, can you adjust with TK? Can you adjust both layers?
So
I don't know if she was asking concurrently or what.
So with the TK plugin, it doesn't do any image adjusting itself. It creates and deploys masks, and it accesses through all of these controls adjustments that are already in Photoshop. So these are all things that Photoshop does anyways. It just gives you a faster way to get to them. So there's no adjusting to images in Photoshop that you can do with TK that are different than you could do with Photoshop without it. So for example, with smart objects, the only way to make those adjustments to the original raw smart object is to open them in Camera Raw, and you can only open up one in Camera Raw at a time. As far as I know, I don't know that there's a way to
I didn't know
open
anything
them
either. So
in Camera Raw at the same time once they're in Photoshop like this.
okay. Make and model of the monitors you use, and maybe she asked that question before we lost you in one of your 3 monitors, but
oh, so my main monitor is a BenQ, a 32-inch BenQ 4K monitor. 2 years old. It's great. I love it. It's a photo editing specific kind of monitor. It's good value for the money. So that one's great. I've got an older NEC that was my old editing monitor that I've made my second monitor. That's where I kind of move panels and stuff off to. And then my third monitor is actually just my little tiny monitor, which is on a teleprompter in front of my camera so that I can look at you guys on Zoom. And I'm also looking at my camera when I do that.
Teleprompter, huh? Serving up
teleprompter with little screen.
Yeah, okay. The scripts. That's great. Well, I'm not sure we kept you so busy you probably haven't caught the chat, but you'll be able to go back and read them. But definitely a lot of really great feedback. Thank you for good techniques. Thank you, Sean. Lots of content covered. Sean, thank you. A lot of people talking through really related to. Well, I'm glad I get to go back. Amazing to see what you can do. So much I enjoyed the teacher presentation and the clarity. Great lesson. Thank you, et cetera, et cetera. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. So lots of great feedback all the way through. So certainly appreciate you spending time. We still have 160 people with us. So either we have 158 that have fallen asleep, or some people are figuring, oh, forego dinner for a little longer or bed. So certainly great to have you with us tonight, Sean, talking through this stuff. For those of you that it's your first time taking one of the classes, I will email out the recordings and the materials later today or early tomorrow morning, depending on how long it takes to get the videos uploaded and kind of pushed in place with the materials, the links, so Sean's download links of all these workflows. That is super valuable to be able to work through as you're watching the videos at a later point in time, which is really helpful. I would be remiss before we drop to not share in brief about the spring speaker series, which is actually starting next week, if you can believe it. Geez, time flies. So this is the end of the winter speaker series, and now we actually have the spring series starting. And I'll send information, and there's opportunity for you guys. It's on the website. And the spring series is called For the Love of the Landscape, or For the Love of Landscape. I think you can see it here. So the idea is really to diversify kind of beyond different areas. So into night photography, infrared photography, small scenes with some of the experts that are out there, tree photography, sand dune photography, some of the well-known, better-known educators out there in a lot of capacity, telephoto landscapes as well. So really bringing together some of these really, really incredible instructors. So super looking forward, hopefully seeing a lot of you continue on with the speaker series as we go forward. And with that, I'll send you information and leave it to you, Sean, to say any closing words before we let you get on with your evening.
Thank you, Nick, for putting this together. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And if you're tuning in for the replay, thanks for tuning in for that. And yeah, like Nick said, definitely this was a lot. I told you that up front, a lot of information coming quick and fast. So that replay and that outline are going to be really useful, I think. So thanks, everyone.
Exactly.
It's been my pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off, and we will be in touch. So thanks all. Thanks for coming. See you, Sean. Take care.
Bye, guys.